In our series, What Shapes You?, we've been discussing the pressures that everybody on earth faces everywhere. And those four pressures are God's transcendence, our personal immanence, the personal impact of family and friends, and then culture, our time and place in life. Now we come to Providence, the God who is actively, personally engaged in all of life. And there are numerous passages in Scripture that discuss this. One of them is Acts chapter 17 and verse 26 that says, God has appointed the times and places for all people to live. In fact, Genesis chapter 12, one of the earlier genealogies in Scripture, actually identifies times and places for people to live, and sometimes the vocations that come out of those times and places. One of my favorites, though, is in Daniel chapter 2, where Daniel is interpreting the king's dream, the king of Babylon's dream. And he says to the king, God is the king and ruler of all things, but he has given into your hand people and times and places, and even the beasts of the field that you have jurisdiction over only because God has given it to you. So, no matter where you live in the world, no matter where you come from, it doesn't matter. God's providence actively, personally invested there. If you live in the city, very specific, the city, a very specific kind of environment or surrounding, God's providence is there. If you come from the country, same thing. Down in the boondocks, God's providence is there. What about your genetics, your DNA, how you're made up? Well, God is actively invested in that as well. What road you're on, where you've come from, where you're going to, matters. God's providence, there too. What are your plans? For the past, you've seen them, but also for the future. Your present life. What are you going to be doing today or tomorrow? God's providence actively engaged in your life. Some other passages of Scripture that really connect for me as it relates to the providence of God specifically come out of the book of Proverbs and chapter 16. There's a great line there in chapter 16 and verse 4 that reads, the Lord has made everything for his purpose. That kind of summarizes it all. All means all, and that's all means. That's really important for us to remember that God is actively invested in everything in our lives. But it's that last verse in the chapter that gets you, where it says that even the lot that's cast into the lap, its consequence, its end result, is controlled by God. So when you go to Las Vegas, even the throw of the dice is under God's control. One of the passages probably that makes a difference in all of our lives, when I think about this, is Joseph. And his brothers, Joseph's brothers, of course, sell him into slavery. All of the awfulness that he has to endure in chapters 38 and following in the book of Genesis. And then we come to the famous line in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, right at the end of the book, where he's talking with his brothers, and he says to them, you meant it to me for bad. You threw me into slavery. That was bad. But God meant it for good. God turned it around. He was actively, providentially invested in my life. But it starts way back in chapter 45 of Genesis, where Joseph says, God sent me. It says that twice in that passage. And then it says, he sent me and made me the Lord of all of Egypt. He is the one that saved his brothers, but also the Israelite race. So God is providentially, actively invested and involved in each one of our lives. It doesn't matter the pressures that we face, those four pressures. They are all under the auspices and the providential care of the God who personally is invested in our lives.